Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here with a continuation, part 3 of our State of Shooting series. I noticed that after the relatively successful first one, which had definitely some math in it, but was less mathy certainly than the second part, which was less successful, I suppose, in terms of viewership, but hopefully a dedicated number of you found the math calculations and everything in that video interesting in any case. I decided for part 3 I'd go back to being a more easy for everyone and interesting for everyone, not necessarily just those mathy inclined folks out there. So what we're going to be talking about today is, like I said, a continuation of shooting, but we'll be talking about the abilities and some of the stats involved with shooting that aren't necessarily about calculating expected values or whatever. So we'll be talking about things like ranges, the different types of, like, the distribution of abilities that we see throughout the shooting profiles, like crits or anti-X or shooting combat, that kind of thing, and how many profiles there are actually in the game. Which is where we'll be starting, actually. But in the meantime, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe down below and keep the buzz going. I think sometime next week, Jonas and I will be making a video about impressions of 4th edition thus far, just in general, which will be nice because I'll have just come off of a relatively competitive 2-day tournament this weekend where I'll be playing OBR. So that'll be my 4th tournament, and it'll be nice to kind of, I don't know, look back and reflect on the first 4 or so months of the game. But anyway, let's get on with today's content. So it should be a bit shorter today because this is mainly just a visual demonstration of some of the things that I had mentioned earlier. We're going to start with a review of parts 1 and 2, just in case you're keeping along with the series or are interested in going back and checking it out if you haven't already. Then we'll be looking at the ranged abilities by alliance, as in Grand Alliance. Then we'll be looking at ranges, including threat ranges of those profiles that we've got in the game. And then the distribution of abilities, like I mentioned before we get to some concluding thoughts. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, so as a review of part 1, we first discussed the nerfs and buffs to shooting since 3rd edition. Basically just an update for those that haven't played a whole lot of 4th or haven't gotten into it just yet but have been meaning to. Then we discussed efficiency, which is basically how much bang for the buck output you're getting per 100 points, which is, I find, a good metric for how you should view your points expenditures with regards to shooting. You can always take something that has really great output, but if it costs a ton, maybe it's ultimately not worth how much you're paying for. Then we moved on to the haves and have-nots, which will be kind of furthering the discussion of today. This was regarding which armies or factions, or Grand Alliances, I guess, typically have good access to shooting or don't. Then we focused on base profiles for the rest of the video as our main topic, which is to say the shooting output and the efficiency thereof before taking into account any other non-War Scroll buffs or conditional buffs even that could appear on the War Scroll, like anti-cav or shooting combat, I suppose, could be something we could look at, or some other special abilities that aren't on the profile itself but down in the War Scroll. And finally, we took a look at the top 17 base profiles. Those weren't just a random number I chose, 17 out of a hat. Those were all of the units that happened to hit an efficiency score, output score of 3 or higher. And so it just happened to be 17 profiles. Okay, so then as a review of part 2, we did I started with, and I kind of regret that I did this because I think I could have just put it in its own video, but I started with the math behind plus and minus 1 to hit, which in many ways would also apply to plus or minus anything that's on a d6 in the game. That said, I do have a MathHammer video where it'll be even more extensively laid out, built more for people that are just generically interested in the idea and that didn't come here to see a shooting-oriented video. So maybe I should have put that at the end. I don't know. And then we took the original 17 that I just mentioned and from part 1 and applied a +1 to hit to that to see how much of a performance improvement that would make and whether they would end up swapping places in their relative rankings with one another. Then we looked at the 20 new units that crossed over the 3.0 performance output threshold because of getting +1 to hit that previously weren't in the original 17. Then we applied a -1 to hit to the original 17 to see how much kind of like of a debuff, like a sort comparison complement to the other part there, the +1 to hit for the original 17, to see how that shuffled up the rankings. And then we took all of the profiles that we'd computed thus far that were 3.0 or higher. So that would be the base profile with +1 to hit and -1 to hit. And then looked at the top 30 profiles, which was an arbitrary cutoff for me. I just wanted to put a nice round number on screen to see who still performed well. And spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but even some units with a -1 to hit are better than some other units with a +1, which is interesting. Anyway, all right, so let's move on to today's content. So we're going to be looking at a lot of graphs today, and not particularly mathy graphs, so don't worry. We're going to start by breaking everything up into the 4 grand alliances, so in the typical order they're usually presented, which is order, chaos, death, and destruction. And we're going to be looking at a chart that's scaled exactly the same, so from 0 to 42. And this is how many ranged profiles that Grand Alliance has. By profiles, I don't mean units, I mean literal, actual, like starting with range, then attacks, then to hit, to wound, rend, damage, and abilities profiles. As in, if a unit has 3 profiles on their war scroll, say an Arcanaut Ironclad, that they could choose from, that counts as 3. Granted, that boat could choose for one of those weapons 2 other options, so that added an additional 2 profiles to the possibility. I could have counted this. There might be some weird exceptions where I counted something either too little or too much. One example is with Lumineth Sentinels. I counted both shooting types as 2 different profiles, and maybe some people wouldn't see it that way. But because it changes the range and the to hit, I considered it almost like it's a different profile. Same thing with Cruel Boys. Of course, that is literally 2 different profiles: Hasty and Aim Shot. The Bolt Boys. So those count as different profiles, even though they could never use both at the same time. So you can, depending on how you look at it, it could go up by a few profiles or down. But it was in the neighborhood of about 300 different units that have shooting at all, and something like 340-ish profiles. That's including endless spells, by the way, which of course we can't do efficiency calculations for because they have no points attached to them. Anyway, so something else about these charts that we're going to have is in blue, which will always be the lowest layer here, will be the units, as in from your battle profiles, the blue category. I could have color-coded it that way here. The blue works out okay, but the heroes are usually in a pinkish color in the battle profiles. But I'm distinguishing between heroes with shooting profiles and units. And this kind of leads to a point that we'll get into in a minute. But I found this to be an interesting divide. And this way, if you just want to compare the amount of units, which is usually what we're focused on when we're talking about shooting, then you can just look at the blue parts, which are always hugging the x-axis there, to get a sense. So, for example, in this image here, you see that even though Stormcast has a greater total number of shooting profiles than cities, or we could say cities has more than Caradron overlords. They actually have fewer units with profiles than Caradron has because the blue is lower, but I sorted these based off of their total amount of profiles. So anyway, let's take a look at them. Obviously, we go from Stormcast to Cities, KO, Seraphon, Lumineth, Daughters, Sylvaneth, Fireslayers, and Ideneth. And there might be something that goes off in your head immediately seeing that list is, well, what are we really looking at here? Like, what, this might not seem to resonate with some people. Like, why is Ideneth lower than Fireslayers? Why is Lumineth lower than Seraphon, right? Because all we're doing is everything counts equally. If you have a profile, and better yet, you have like a few units that have multiple profiles, which would have counted multiple times for that one unit, then they all count equally, regardless of how many good shooting units you have, or what the balance between heroes and units is, or any other kind of calculation you might take into account to see it, to like rank how these units should be ranked based off of whether they're typically ranged armies or not. For example, Caradron fell into third place here, even though it is literally, except for a couple units, an all shooting army. Like almost every single profile has a shooting profile, or every unit has a shooting profile, at least one. It's kind of like their thing, right? But this brings me to another point: is that Stormcast just has way more units in their book. So does Cities, and so even though not they don't have as high a percentage of shooting units or units with range profiles, they end up hitting a higher gross number here just because of how many units are in the book. If I had ranked this based off of how many profiles we have relative to how many war scrolls there are, then Caradron would certainly be the highest in the game. But anyway, so what else can we kind of glean from this chart? Are there any other big surprises? Well, if you look at, again, that Fyreslayer's Ideneth comparison there, they actually have the same total number of profiles in their armies. For Fyreslayers, if I'm not mistaken, that would be the 3 Magma Droths. Those each count as a hero, so that's why the blue and for units and orange for heroes are even. And then I don't know if I'm going to get this right off the top of my head, but the units that have shooting on them would be, oh, I do have it right, yeah. The 2 manifestations, which barely counts as a unit, right, that have shooting profiles. And then the, what's it called, Auric Hearthguard. And if I'm not mistaken, that's it. Maybe I missed one thing in there, but I think that's right. And would you call that a shooting army? I don't know. Even if we looked at Fyreslayers in 3rd edition, they actually would have all had shooting attacks because they all had the little throwing axes, but no one would have called it a shooting faction. They don't really have that anymore. That got moved into a battle trait, a rune now. But anyway, Ideneth is certainly a more potent shooting army. I mean, we've got Thralls, which are one of the best, most efficient units per point in terms of output, even though the range is a little bit lacking. And a decent threat range with run and shoot and retreat and shoot. You've got the Alopexes, and you've got the Leviathan. Not that the Leviathan's particularly great at shooting per point, but it's decent shooting profile for a monster. And you might be saying, well, why is that ranked here? That's certainly not a quality assessment here, and that's the most important thing to say here. We are just counting, all right? So Ideneth also has a relatively small bench, and it just means that they don't match up with some of these other things. But I would argue Ideneth is a better shooting army than Seraphon, even though it's way lower on the list here. If I were to rank them by quality of shooting, I'd probably say, depending on what you mean by shooting, do you mean the shooting outputs can be oppressive because they're good at other things too, like the Huracan units, especially before the nerf in Lumineth were? Or do you mean that they're just great output? Stormcast would certainly be one of the higher ones. Cities can get there if you focus on it. KO is built around shooting, but then again, they're not exactly the best shooting army in the game. They just have consistently good shooting across the whole army. Daughters can be good at shooting. Sylvaneth has, some amount, but I would say it's more niche-y shooting. So it really depends on how you look at it. But this is just accounting. An accounting of everything that's going on in Grand Alliance Order. On that note, it'll get a lot easier as we go into the other Grand Alliances because Order is kind of the shooting Grand Alliance. So let's move on to Chaos. And I've scaled all these the same so you can kind of see a relative decrease once we move away from Order into Chaos here, or the other ones. Skaven is clearly the winner with around 25-ish units that are profiles, I should say, not necessarily units. As in separate war scrolls, but we've got something around about 15 units, as in non-heroes, and then the rest is supplied by the hero profiles. That's followed up by Tzeentch, which, as you can see, is maybe even more heroes than it is units, but pretty much all the units that can shoot have weird flames, so I guess that's kind of cool. I think Kyrics don't, but I might have that wrong. Slaves, strangely enough, has the 3rd most in Chaos, but keep in mind Chaos doesn't necessarily, it's not really a shooting faction, so that's not saying much. Once you get past Tzeentch, there's not really much to say, with an exception of Slaanesh, but we'll get there in a sec. Beasts, strangely, is number 4, and that leads me to the point that the Stormcast that I calculated are included in the previous graph was including the sacrosanct stuff, but that of course is going to go away in July. Nurgle is mostly heroes, plus I guess one unit, the Rotmire Creed, that's got a shooting profile. Slaanesh is a weird one here because they're actually known for being a great shooting army if you build it that way, but that's entirely on the backs of the two Blissbarb units, the fast cavalry unit and the regular foot archers. And those are literally the two units that they have in that army. And then Khorne has got 2 and 2. So anyway, Skaven is clearly the leader in terms of profiles. And interestingly, I would actually rank these mostly this order in terms of the quality of shooting. There's a version of reality where you put Slaanesh higher than Tzeentch, but I think Skaven's clearly, as long as you're building towards Scryer, clearly the best shooting army in Chaos and one of the best shooting armies in the game. So they just also happen to have a lot of shooting choices. Moving on to Death. You can see that they're all kind of about even because Death is just not a shooting alliance. If you had to pick one to be on top, I guess you'd say maybe Nighthaunt or Soulblight here, followed by Feck and then OBR. But in reality, I'm actually playing a 2 crawlers list right now, Mortek crawlers list and OBR. I would actually say OBR is probably the strongest shooting army out of these just because of how much those 2 units can spike and how much utility they bring. But there could be some argument for the Pyregeist or maybe Craven Throne Guard in Nighthaunt. I would not say Soulblight really counts, and definitely not Feck. This is just relative to each other. But these armies are all not really shooting armies. And maybe that's good that a whole Grand Alliance isn't about that. Speaking of which, Destruction is also not really a shooting army, and this chart might actually give you the wrong impression. If you had to look at this chart and say which army is the best at shooting, I don't think you would say you'd probably go for Ogres, right? But the reality is it's Kruleboyz in terms of just their good units. Maybe you could kind of see that because their whole bar, literally, as far as I'm aware, none of their heroes have a shooting profile. And their numbers are entirely made up by units, like the Beaskewer, Killbow, and the Bolt Boys, Manskewer Bolt Boys, which really, especially the latter, can do quite a lot of damage and have a lot of efficiency and value. The reason Ogres are so high is a little bit KO-esque, is that Ogres, for some strange reason, especially the heroes, a lot of those units just have a random shooting profile attached to the unit, but they're not necessarily good, especially for their points. They're much better at melee. But like all of the Beast Claw guys pretty much have some kind of, the big ones at least, have some kind of shooting profile. And that means, especially considering they can choose different things like the Blood Vulture or this, that, or the other. I counted the Blood Vulture and the other armaments they could have for shooting, by the way, multiple times if they were on different war scrolls. But if they're on the same war scroll, but you chose like, I guess that's how everyone would do it. But let's say you took a Huskard, I forget which one it is, Thunder Tusk, let's say, and then you've got 3 different shooting profiles plus the Thunder Tusk one. I didn't count the Thunder Tusk one again, right? Just because you could have chosen as a chosen weapon of the three different things. And anyway, that's too long. Too long didn't read. I tried to reduce the numbers there, but I didn't do it on a war scroll to war scroll basis. So the hero versions of those, or at least the non-hero version, got to also have those iterations of the Blood Vulture and so forth. Okay, anything surprising on here? Gits? Not really. I wouldn't say so. None of this stuff is that interesting at the end of the day. It's just here for your comparison. So let's take a look at the full set here, sorted by total number of range profiles. And this really lets you see how much everything falls off. By the time you get to, let's say, by the time you get to Slaves, which is around 10 profiles, everything beyond there is starting to be questionably a shooting army. That said, some of them can still build things after that, but we're getting into pretty low numbers. So the top 5 then, in terms of number of range profiles, was these Stormcast Cities, KO, Ogres, and Skaven. But we know out of those, Ogres doesn't really belong. Then Seraphon, I would also kind of take out of the picture. They can do it, but like it's not necessarily good, with a few exceptions. Zinch can do it, but it still isn't the most efficient. Lumineth, though, and Daughters probably deserve to be a little higher. And then if you scroll all the way down to, say, like Ideneth, which is towards the back end there, they're actually, and Slanesh are actually pretty good despite the fact that they don't have a lot of profiles. And Cruel Boys. So anyway, there you go. One of the reasons I wanted to separate out heroes is because we all know that we're trying to get low drops right now, and unless your hero can be taken as an italics hero, what some people name a bonus hero that can be taken in a regiment instead of as the leader of a regiment, thus not raising your drops, you're probably not leaning into heroes, and you can't reinforce them. They often aren't efficient for their output, and so oftentimes when we're looking at shooting, we're actually looking at the number of units that have shooting profiles. And so if we were to sort this based off of that, it might change the numbers a little bit, but that said, again, this chart doesn't really address how good the quality of shooting is. This is just more an overview of what's out there. But let's move on. So we've also got ranges to consider, right? So I sorted the ranges and collected them from all the units, including the endless spells, which the generic endless spells, as well as the faction ones. But the faction ones were included in the last set of graphs, and then because the generic ones don't belong to a faction, they didn't get included, but now they are. And that would be just the Horror Gas from Forbidden Power, and then the Burning Head from, what is that, from Primal Energy. So anyway, we're ranking things from left to right as from the longest range characteristic that we've got, not accounting for, say, battle traits that extend your range, like in KO or cities, and then going all the way down to a 6-inch range. So these are the range characteristics on those profiles. I didn't bin them like I will in the next graph, so we are seeing just literally each distinct range that's possible in the game. Clearly, the most prevalent is 12 inches, which tells you something. When we talked about ranges getting reduced, I'd be curious to see what this graph looked like in 3rd edition. I haven't made it, but I would be curious to see how much more reduced it was. Again, none of this says anything about the quality of those shooting attacks. So if you reduce the average shooting attack, but it's like a crappy shooting attack, but didn't reduce the really great shooting attacks, then it would be less meaningful. But anyway, you see that even numbers tend to be the most common here with 24, 18, 12, 10, and yeah, I guess those are the top 4. 15 thrown in there too, so I guess 15 gets a little bit of love. But and then everything else that's around them could probably be lumped in with one of the other ones if you wanted, thus binning them. But I thought it would be nice to see them separate here. But 12 is the most common, which again, kind of going to the point, if you teleported with a unit like that outside of 9 and they make a redeploy of at least 3 inches because you were outside of 9, now you're outside of 12, which means you're outside of range and you're not going to hit. So that's like on a 2 out of 3 on a die roll, essentially. You are not able to hit anything. And if the vast majority of units have a 12-inch shooting range, or at least profiles, I should say, then that makes a difference. Granted, the units you're probably taking for such an army that can teleport a shooting unit probably have longer ranges, like an 18-inch, which seems to be pretty popular. And so this would also kind of take into account, let's say you had an ability that made your unit better without moving, then you're stuck to these actual shooting profile ranges. But the following chart, which will be our threat ranges, is going to expand on what it feels like actually. This is just if you're thinking about covering fire where you didn't get to move or were not taking into account both a redeploy and a covering fire, that kind of thing, then this is what you're dealing with and what exists in the game. I also separated out by heroes in the same way because for the same reason as before. A lot of times we're not really leaning into the heroes here, if we're being honest. So 12 is still the champ, still the most if you just look at units, but it gets a lot closer because there's a whole lot of heroes with 12-inch ranges. Like there's 111 units profiles in total with 12-inch range, but about half of those are heroes, which is saying something. Okay, so now looking at threat ranges. I computed threat range as your movement characteristic plus range plus run and shoot equals 6 inches if you have a run and shoot ability. And because these created way more values, so that would be like between 9 and 36 inches, I bend them into 7 equally sized groups, not into quantiles. And so you can see, obviously not into quantiles because it's an uneven distribution here. It's a little bit normal, but not really. Um, so the most common range group, threat range group here is 21 to 24 inches. So something like 117 or so, something like that, profiles have a 21 to 24 inch threat range. And I didn't separate heroes and units here. This is just all things combined because that was just a bit more work than I wanted to do, and I don't know how much extra value it added. So just imagine what we had before and kind of adjust appropriately, knowing it could be as much as half of what we see here. Second most popular was 17 to 20 inch threat range. So ultimately, that's pretty easy to see that the vast majority of threat ranges you can deal with is going to be somewhere between 17 to 24 inches. The third most common will be 25 to 28, so a little bit higher. And then just under that would be 13 to 16. So the vast majority of profiles are somewhere between a 13 to 28 inch threat range. And then we start getting into really outlier type stuff with 29 to 32 sitting on about, I don't know, 20-ish profiles. 33 to 36 sitting on about 16 profiles. And then 9 to 12 inch threat range, which is really low, sitting on, I don't know, 8 or so profiles, 7 or 8. So that gives us a kind of an idea of how far you have to actually be standing to screen out some of the shooting, and or otherwise, or the other way around, what you have to do to get most of the shooting into effective range, and how much you're going to need to have a low drops list to guarantee that your shooting actually gets to hit something on turn one, especially if they deploy conservatively. So, it's this kind of thing. Granted, as I've said a number of times in this video, this is not talking about the quality of shooting that's at those ranges. It's just talking about, um, the ranges there. Maybe at some point, it's interesting. It'll be interesting for me once I've done all the calculations for all the best units in the game to take maybe the top 30 or so and then take a look at their ranges and the other metrics. All right, moving on to kind of our last group for the day would be the distribution of different abilities that you'll see on a War Scroll. So in this case, we're looking at crits. This is not looking at things that don't have a crit ability on them. We'll talk about that in a second. This is just looking at all the things that do have either crit 2 hits, crit auto wound, or crit mortal, how they're distributed. And you can see that auto wound is the most common if you have a crit ability for a shooting profile at 51%, but that's only 33 profiles out of, like, what did we say, like about 340 profiles. So don't get too excited about it. It's not like a third of the profiles in the game are auto wound. That said, a lot of the good ones do have it because they're the same units that in 3rd edition used to have mortals. While I'm speaking on mortals, well, let's just go to that real quick. There's only 4 profiles that have that, and that's literally on each of the 4 War Scrolls for the Gaunt Summoners, which is a little unfair because it's really the same exact shooting profile on a foot version, and an on disc version for 2 different armies with the exact same War Scroll, so Slaves and Tzeentch. So it's a little bit misleading. So just know that that mortals has a big asterisk next to it to say it's just Gaunt Summoners. And if you wanted to see that as one profile, I wouldn't blame you, though we'd have to change the way we look at some of the other things we've accounted for in this summary throughout the whole video. And then 2 hits, crit 2 hits, which functionally feels like +1 to hit built in, but is spikier, is 43% of the crit types distribution, but that's only on 28 different profiles. So you're mostly looking at auto wound or 2 hits, unless you're playing a million Gaunt Summoners for some reason. But that's not very efficient or really a good idea, I think. All right, moving on to anti-X, as in we've got anti-infantry, cavalry, monster, hero, wizard, demon, and war machine. You can actually see the breakdown on the right a little bit better than in the graph because some of the slices there got a little too small. But obviously our biggest one is not infantry, which I would have assumed, if I'm being honest. I think infantry might be the most common with melee profiles, but not with shooting profiles. For whatever reason, if you have an anti-type profile, the most common one is monster at 42% of all anti-types, anti-X shooting profiles is anti-monster with 25 different profiles that have that. That's kind of interesting. And then a little bit below that at 23 times is infantry. So it's not like they're that far off from each other, but that is something. Then the next most common would be the anti-hero, but that's only 5 profiles that have it. Anti-cav is only 4 profiles, which makes my kind of pet unit, the Warp Volt Scourgers and Skaven, which is one of them, notably better, especially going into a cavalry meta. And the thing about anti-monsters, it's great, but only if you're trying to shoot monsters, right? And I don't know if we're in a monster meta right now. We certainly are in an infantry meta, though, so that's a great ability to have. And then we've got in diminishing amounts, we've got Wizard. There are 2 profiles, anti-Wizard, 1 anti-Demon, I think that's Lyrio Thrall, and 1 anti-War Machine, that's the Burning Head. So, random. Anyway, so those are the anti-types. And then last is Miscellaneous Attributes. So, Companion, we've got around 44 or so profiles that have companion keyword, which means they don't benefit from any buffs except for all-out attack or sometimes random other profiles, abilities that specifically say that those companions can use it. But for shooting, I think that's extra rare. So yeah, we've got some companion profiles in there. And then I broke down shooting combat into 2 different groups. If you looked at it in total, we're looking at about 65 plus about 55. So putting us at about 120 shooting combat profiles. The reason I wanted to split these up into hero and unit, though, is because a lot of times they give them to heroes so that if someone does charge them, at least they can get their little weenie shot out while they're still in combat, and that kind of adds to their output a little bit. But shooting combat is unfortunately not an ability we see on shooting units much anymore, really, especially the really good ones. And I guess that's a good balancing factor. Once you pin them in combat, they're basically turned off until they retreat out and then maybe get a turn where they get to shoot the next turn if they double or something. But most likely it means they're dead and they're just not doing what they're supposed to do. But those units that do have it end up, having definitely a tangible bonus that's hard to quantify in terms of output. But it does mean that, especially if they've got some amount of durability, tankiness, that they could survive around and then still get to shoot at least into their attacking the unit that's attacking them the following round. Okay, that kind of brings us to some closing thoughts. I mean, this one was quicker today, hopefully, and interesting. When I say at the same time, I kind of find it a little less interesting. I don't know about you guys out there. Let me know down in the comments below. I do think this is more generic for everyone out there, but at the same time, it doesn't actually solve any list building kind of problems or questions you might have. It gives you a better overview for what's out there and what's reasonable to expect. So maybe if you were looking at, like, I don't know, oh, my unit only has 18-inch range, that sucks. Well, not really. 18 was one of the higher range characteristics that we saw, and it was definitely one of the second, more commonly occurring than 24. And 24 is the only other one that occurs somewhat frequently. So I wouldn't really see that as a bad thing. And now that you've got some context for it, maybe that makes it a little easier pill to swallow. Yes, range is reduced, but you're still in the kind of upper percentiles of what's out there. Similarly, looking at like auto wound or crit to hits, I think it gives you a perspective. Also good to know that mortals really are pretty much gone from shooting attacks. Unless I didn't include, of course, profiles like the Warp Lightning Cannon that have it as a not crit mortals ability. So those still exist, but those are also kind of few and far between. So it's just good to keep that in mind. It's also worth pointing out I didn't take into account that Slanesh can like give the Bliss Barbs, I guess, crit 2 hits and then turn that into mortals, crit mortals. That's an ability that's outside of their War Scrolls. So I was really just looking at the War Scrolls. I didn't bring in all the army abilities. But anyway, those are some thoughts that I didn't put on the slide. Let's look at some thoughts that I did. So the vast majority of shooting profiles aren't going to be commonly seen, especially if on heroes. Keep in mind we were looking at profiles. Once again here, we weren't looking at number of units. And though most units only have 1 profile, there's plenty that have more than one, enough that it kind of inflates the numbers here. And when you're looking at heroes, again, like I said earlier, the heroes are often, if you take them and they happen to have a shooting profile that's decent, like I don't know, a Brock Grungson or Drucky Flint or something, then cool, you've got a great shooting profile on a hero. But most of the time, they are just not pulling their weight. And I'd take the heroes with shooting profiles as more of like a icing on the cake than anything else. Um, and even for the units, as in like non-hero units, um, the vast majority of the ones that would have been accounted for in this video aren't actually the kind that you're taking. Like we said with Slanesh, they've basically got two profiles that are worth taking, and those are great profiles. But then if you go over to like Seraphon, there's plenty of way more profiles, but most of them just aren't worth their weight in points, if you will. So this is definitely not a way to determine quality, and that's really what we're trying to do in the other videos, even though it gets mathier and maybe not everyone's thing. But, once I get done with the series, I'll try to wrap it up with a summary of everything we talked about in a kind of capsule kind of delivery mechanism where you guys aren't having to listen to all the explanation, just kind of seeing the results in one big video. But anyway, second point, while certain abilities might be more prevalent than others, they are ultimately still on a small fraction of existing profiles. Meaning, what I said earlier, like, yes, anti-monster is the most common anti-profile, but it's only on a small fraction of units in the game. It's not that many. So I wouldn't start thinking, oh, everyone's got anti-monster. That's just not how it works. Again, if we then first filtered for all the best units in the game and then looked at what abilities they have, something like Auto Wound would be actually really common, much more than it is in the kind of just normal population. And last point, factions with more profiles aren't necessarily dominant in shooting, especially if factions with fewer profiles are much more efficient. I've basically already said this with the Slanesh example, Ideneth, Seraphon as the other way around. KO is somewhere kind of in the middle. They're good at shooting, but more because they're just consistently decent across the whole army and not necessarily overpowering. It's just that everything's got shooting, so they're just doing a lot of work in the shooting phase without even having to build a list around it per se. Whereas a lot of armies have to choose to take shooting units at the risk that they get glass cannoned off the table, if you will, by being good at punching but not being good at taking. They end up having a risk reward mechanism where KO is actually pretty good, Stormcast as well, at having shooting units and not having them die right away, except for maybe the balloon guys, but even still. All right, so that's it. What'd you guys think of this video? A little bit shorter today, way more kind of just everyone's cup of tea, I guess. My following video is going to be, if everything goes according to plan, focusing on, just like we did with the +1 to and -1 to hit, we're going to look at the anti-abilities first. Because we already took care of all the crit abilities because they were built into the output. They were always going off. But the anti-abilities, like anti-infantry, anti-cav, whatever, are situational, right? So one way of doing it is that we're going to look at just all profiles where we'll include all the profiles we've already got with +1 to hit, base, -1 to hit, everything we've already got. And then we'll throw into the soup those same units with all three of those conditions. So base, +1 to hit, -1 to hit, but against the preferred units. The fortunate thing is there aren't that many units with anti-profiles, so especially those that cross the 3.0 threshold. So it won't add as many as it sounds like it'll add to the list, but we will kind of calculate for everything and then re-rank based on that. Another way of looking at it is saying that all units simultaneously had to shoot into cavalry because like the unit that's charging you is cavalry. Which unit is going to be the best if they're going into cavalry? Maybe I'll do like the top 10 or top 15 if that's the case and just make a shorter summary of that. And then, obviously that would kind of say if you're leaning towards a specific meta, which ones are you going to want to take the most often? Obviously, infantry is a pretty common meta. I don't know about monster. But anyway, so that's the plan for the next video, I think, in the series. But in the meantime, we'll have a video with Jonas and myself. And I think I'll probably make an OBR video index review sometime within the next few weeks. Because I've been putting a lot of time into OBR. It's actually my most played army in 4th edition thus far, overtaking Ideneth recently. And I'm really passionate about it. I really like the army. I'll probably end up doing that one just by myself, but looking forward to doing that. And then I'll probably do breakdown videos like I did for Ideneth, where we look at groups of, like, say, infantry, cavalry, heroes, that kind of stuff, and then miscellaneous stuff in different videos, looking at their stats comparisons and like what they're best used for. But anyway, that's kind of a view into the future, and who knows, maybe we'll do some other stuff in the meantime. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, guys, and until next time, Ryan out.